Welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. I am recording this on July 4th, 2022. So happy July 4th to all of you, celebrating our very fine, beautiful, amazing, gorgeous nation, this United States of America. And on this particular 4th of July, I actually will be quarantining myself because I may have, I'm not 100% sure, but it seems entirely possible, I may have contacted COVID last week, and I have been a bit sick, under the weather. Happy to say that the last 2 days I have been feeling much better. But to be on the safe side, I think I will be avoiding people on this fine holiday. And it's been interesting to be sick, to possibly have COVID again. I moved all of my clients at the end of last week onto Zoom, and canceled all my in-person meetings and everything. And it was a real kind of flashback to the early days of the pandemic, and I had that sense of like, I thought we were past this, but obviously, COVID's still here. It still deserves to be respected, and we have to all do the best that we can do. And then it's just been interesting to see the responses I've gotten when I tell people that I'm sick, that I likely do have COVID. Yeah, some people I spoke to are like, oh, I don't care, and they like want to give me a hug. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. They're so confident in their immune system and they're not worried about COVID at all. And then some people I talk to who are like, freaking out, oh my God, they're really worried. And it's like they're trying to move farther away from me while we're like talking on the phone or something. I'm like, I don't think that this virus, however powerful it may or may not be, is going to travel through the cellular phone wires to infect you. But, I appreciate your concern. So there's just this wide range of reactions, and it definitely provokes a reaction in almost everyone, so much more than the flu or any other disease. And, I think that obviously good reasons for that, but at some point, I think this will become more and more normal. And I don't know if it's really fair to those other diseases. There's a lot of other horrible diseases out there too. But because of the pandemic and whatnot, we, just have this emotional reaction to COVID one way or the other. And then, of course, I'm kind of asking myself how I was susceptible to catching it. Can't blame myself. I don't mean that, but I just think I've been doing a lot, and I've been expending a lot of my energy outwards. And so that left me more vulnerable to it. And so part of this last few days for me has been, taking time to myself. I realize I talk to people a lot. I'm doing a lot of talking and using my voice a lot. And I actually think I need to learn how to consciously rest my voice more often. So I'm not expending so much energy all the time. Happy to say that I have been sleeping really well. I've been giving myself 9.5 hours of sleep every night. I actually feel really well rested and rejuvenated now. And I make a point to bring this up because our sleep is so important, so foundational, so fundamental, not only to our physical health, but to our mental health as well. And so this has been a chance for me to hit the reset button a bit on my own life, because I'm noticing that I actually feel healthier and happier when I sleep more. And my meditation practice in the morning has felt stronger and more clear and more grounded after consistently giving myself extra sleep, actually. So I'm noticing that, and I'm just noticing a renewed commitment in myself to balancing work, social life with rejuvenation time. Today's podcast is a good one. Today I'm speaking with Geoff Barstow. So Geoff is a scholar and professor at Oregon State University. He teaches several courses on Buddhism there. And he has done a lot of research and writing on the question of vegetarianism in Buddhism, specifically in the Tibetan Buddhist world. He's written 2 books on this topic. One is called The Food of Sinful Demons, Meat, Vegetarianism, and the Limits of Buddhism in Tibet, and a companion volume called The Faults of Meat, which has translations of Tibetan Buddhist writings on vegetarianism. This is a really rich, in-depth conversation. One of the themes of this podcast has been for me to get to speak with Buddhist scholars like Geoff, and I really appreciate those opportunities. I think that the Tibetan Buddhist teachings have so much to offer us, and they can be really valuable, and they're worth thinking about. And this question of vegetarianism is a rich one, and there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complex issues with it. And it was refreshing to hear his research that shows that, it's not a new question. And Buddhists in Tibet, and before that in India, have been debating this topic for hundreds of years, for over thousands of years. And I'm sure that the same is true in China and Japan and everywhere that Buddhism went. And I think more broadly, it's just true in general. And it's just good to recognize that, it's not a new thing. It's something that humans have been struggling with for a long time. And so I think that this topic is worth thinking about, and this conversation is well worth listening to. And so I hope that listeners gain something from it and can kind of reflect on these issues on a deeper level, and then make their own decisions that feel good for them. I think it's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. A lot of people tend to avoid it. And I had some trepidation myself going into it. But I've actually been feeling a lot better and more clear since talking to Geoff and spending some time thinking about these issues anew. And it's had a practical impact in my own life. I've been eating less meat and making more conscious decisions when I do choose to eat meat. And that actually feels better to me. It feels more in alignment with my own values. I don't know if I will become 100% vegetarian again, but I am trending in that direction a good bit and finding balance for me, and that feels right for me in my life at this time. And it actually feels better, paradoxically, to face the reality that these animals, especially mammals like cows and pigs, I 100% believe that they have emotions, that they have strong family bonds, that they can form things like friendships, that they have some forms of thought. I definitely think that that's true, and I think that the human-animal divide is not nearly as clear as we like to pretend. I honestly think all life on this planet is incredibly interconnected and dependent on each other, but also that at a really minute kind of cellular DNA level, we're all really made of the same stuff. And it's amazing to think about. I think it's also true. So I hope you appreciate this conversation as much as I do. I hope it gives you good food for thought, and that you chew that food well and digest it, and that it then informs you in making better, more clear, and hopefully more compassionate choices in your own life. And then you can feel the benefits of that for yourself, and then also feel that you're making the world a better place. I think it's a win-win. I think it can all go together. So, without further ado, I bring you Geoff Barstow. Today with Geoff Barstow. Geoff, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, hey Julian, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And we had a mutual connection in common, Catherine Dalton, right?
Yeah, Catherine is one of my oldest friends in the Dharma. We studied at Rongjung Yeshe together way back in the early 2000s.
So, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I had a semester there. I spent a year in Nepal.
Okay.
In
cool.
Like 2006 to 2007. So.
We would have just missed each other then. Okay. I was there from about 2002 to 2006.
Oh, that's quite a long stay. So you were learning Tibetan and Buddhist philosophy?
Yeah, I was at Rongjung Yeshe doing the Rongjung Yeshe thing. Yeah, and I'll give them a quick plug. If any of your listeners are familiar with Rongjung Yeshe and are looking for a place to study Tibetan or study Buddhism in a fairly traditional kind of environment, they're wonderful. I had an amazing time there. I take my own students there now. It's really it's a great place and a great institution. But yeah, I was there right after college, and I got into Buddhism when I was in college, and really that was just sort of what I wanted to do when I graduated, and so I did. And I was fortunate to be able to work for a while, save enough money, and Nepal was inexpensive enough at the time that I could just sort of work over the summers and then live off of that for the other 9 months of the year in Nepal. And so, yeah, I spent 3 years fully in the Rongjung Yeshe program, learning Tibetan, studying Buddhist philosophy, reading texts. And then basically 1 more year after that, where I was not formally enrolled in the programs at Rongjung Yeshe, but was still in the area and still pretty connected to that world.
So do you want to share with us a little bit about your backstory and how you got into Buddhism and how you got connected with that in particular? Because it's a pretty unique, thing to get into.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been kind of interested in religious questions, and I remember spending a lot of time in high school thinking about these things. And I was going to church for a while, and at some point that wasn't really fitting anymore, and so I spent a while kind of dabbling in some new agey stuff. I bought myself a few crystals and things like that. And I got really into Taoism through reading the Tao of Pooh. And then I went to college and decided I wanted to take a course on Taoism. And so I took this course on Taoism. And one of the first things I realized was that like Taoism as it was actually practiced in China was essentially nothing like the Tao of Pooh. And
can you
so,
speak to that a little bit?
well, I mean, we're talking about like lived Taoism in China. And so we're talking about questions of alchemy and, Shanda, the celestial masters and ritual and all of these things, which are really not what I was sort of, as my sort of naive high school self, right? I wanted to walk the earth, like, and practice Tai Chi and that's not really what lived Taoism has been about for a very long time.
That's interesting. They don't have a lot of stuffed bears over there.
Yeah. And so I, then that kind of put me back on the experimenting path. And then I sort of fell into this opportunity to go to India and learn about Buddhism. And that was in the January, I think, of 1999. And it was great. I spent a month in Sarnath at what was then called the Central Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies. It was this, study abroad program. So I was there with, 15 or 20 other students. And then when I got back to the US, that was what I wanted to be studying. And so I started taking those classes. I started studying Chinese because that was the only sort of Buddhist language that was available to me in that area. And then I went on the Antioch program, where I think a surprising number of us who have ended up in academia are Antioch alums.
Yeah, I was one of them. I did the study abroad program in Bodh Gaya.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So when were you there?
I guess it must have been fall of 2005.
Okay, yeah, I was there fall of 2000.
Wow.
I remember that because it was I like baseball. It was the Mets and Yankees Subway Series, and one of our instructors would actually read the play-by-play 24 hours later, so we could all follow the World Series, even though we had no internet and no access to international news. I think her mother actually faxed over each day's play-by-play for the World Series.
You are dating yourself, okay?
I know, I am. We had no internet. We had to send letters on paper. Yeah, it makes me feel old. But that the other thing about that trip is, as you'll know, right, is you have this month to go off and do research. And I got connected with Tricky Rinpoche, and so I wanted to deepen that connection. I went up to Kathmandu for that month, and that was when I learned about Rangchen Yeshe. I learned about these programs that they were just starting to get up and running. And I, honestly, I wanted to just stay. And, Rinpoche was very compassionate and said, no, you need to go back to the US and finish your degree. Yeah. So I did. But then, from that point on, it was always, okay, I'm going to finish this up so that I can get out the door and get back to Nepal. And, and so then by the fall of 2000, I graduated, I guess, January of 2021 or 2001 and worked for a while as a file person in a law firm. It was just an hourly wage to save as much as I could, and then went to Nepal in the fall of 2022 and immediately got very sick. And and that was how you do it. So
yeah, and it sounds like you had quite a bit of time there. Are you able to speak Tibetan? Did you get to that point of being able to?
I'm not a translator, right? Like I'm not a translator. I can, I can have a conversation with people in Tibetan and I can interview people. And, when I left Nepal, my colloquial spoken Tibetan was much better than my classical reading. In the years since then, I've spent, a good bit of time. I mean, it's the great good fortune of having a job like mine, where I do get to travel a lot. And so I've spent a good bit of time in Kham and other parts of Tibet. And so
cool.
I get to keep I get to keep in practice but I'm definitely not a translator. Um,
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I feel like if I had had better discipline as a student, my language skills would be better right now.
I can relate to that too. I never got too far with it, but I tried a couple times to start learning Tibetan.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's a challenging language, obviously. And
yeah,
this is an amazing. I'm fascinated by the culture,
mm-hmm.
um, you know. But
Yeah.
so, I mean, you're someone who is drawn obviously to academia. And is it
Mm-hmm.
fair to describe yourself as kind of a scholar practitioner? That's a,
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
yeah.
I mean, the truth is like, I think sometimes people feel like, there's like being a Buddhist practitioner and an academic scholar, right, are these sort of like somehow in opposition with each other.
Hmm.
And the truth is, I guess it's never really felt that way to me, right? Like I feel like they actually, those sort of two identities fit together very well and have really been sort of the things that I've, managed to sort of focus my life around. Again, it's like, I find myself in this really amazing position of being able to professionally study, Buddhist history and Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist ethics and all of those things. Um, Sometimes, you wake up in the morning, you kind of pinch yourself how fortunate I feel to be in that position.
Huh.
But all of that then feeds back into my life as a practitioner, right, and as a Buddhist, and then my life as a Buddhist also then informs my scholarship. And I don't feel like these aren't like different goals, right? We're both of these are promoting inquiry and questioning the status quo, and
Mm.
generally trying to sort of increase our awareness of the world around us and of our interactions with it and all of that. So to me, these have never really felt like competing positions, but rather sort of very complementary. There's sort of different methodologies perhaps.
Yeah.
But the goal is not that different, right? If the goal of both is greater awareness, greater understanding,
Hmm.
then there are different ways of approaching similar kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I mean, I love how in the Buddhist traditions there's this, it's such an integral part of the tradition to be a scholar practitioner. There's these great
Mm.
scholars, philosophers. Tibet produced so many texts, right? It was one of the most literate of these kinds of pre-modern civilizations, and that I think deserves to be honored and recognized and appreciated. And
Yeah.
but the modern academic world is something different. And I remember when I was in religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, there was definitely this attitude of like, we're studying this thing called religion, but like none of us actually believe in that stuff. There was just a
Yeah.
lot of attitude around that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I think the tides are changing. I hope they are, because I think it's
Absolutely.
bullshit. So,
Yeah. No. Absolutely. And that, as
there,
you
there were
say,
literally like, there was this great
yeah.
Muslim scholar there, and he was like a kind of closeted Islamic. I think he was actually interested in Sufism on a personal level, but he would
Mhm.
never talk about that publicly. And I was just like,
Right.
why? Why? What's the point of this?
Yeah. It is bullshit, and of course it's also there's a lot of that attitude has colonialist and
Mm,
Orientalist legacies to it, right? The scholar of Islam couldn't out himself as a Muslim, or if you were a scholar of Buddhism, you couldn't really be a Buddhist, right?
right,
But nobody would bat an eye if you were a scholar of Christianity and also Christian, right? Like
right,
that,
right.
that would have been totally fine even 50 years ago. But no, I think the good news is that a lot of this is changing, right? I mean, many of my colleagues are, interested in Buddhism on personal levels as well as professional, and some aren't, right? And there's plenty of room for both of those. But I don't feel like there's a drive to be kind of like a closet Buddhist anymore
Less judgment around it.
within the academic study of Buddhism. Um, it gives you a different perspective perhaps, but we all have different perspectives. And one of the things I think that's driving this change is also nobody believes in this like myth of academic impartiality
I was going to say,
anymore.
yeah, the
Like, this is
objectivity.
obvious bullshit. We all have baggage, right? We all come from this conglomeration of backgrounds, and everybody recognizes that. And
Mm,
so there's no longer a sense like somebody who's not Buddhist can be objective in a way that someone who is Buddhist can't, because nobody's objective and
Hmm.
nobody claims objectivity.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. And then, I mean,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
other thing I see happening is these beautiful traditions and cultures and the interplay with the West and East, however you want to talk about it. But there's a real sense, obviously, that things change, things evolve, and what I'm excited to see more of is people who are, say, practicing Buddhists for 20, 30, however many years, like making their contributions to the tradition here,
Mm.
rather than this attitude of, which I think is also a kind of suspect attitude of like, it's trying to preserve this perfectly pure thing and
Right.
we have nothing to add to it. And that's not
Yeah.
going to help either, right? At least in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's going to change, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think, no, you're right. I mean, the more objectivity we bring to that. And one of the things I'm sitting here thinking about is, going back to this kind of like, I was talking about this sort of sense that some people have of like separation between like the academic side and the practitioner side. And I'm thinking about like all of the amazing conversations I've had with like Tibetan Khenpos,
Hmm.
where, we're discussing something, right? We're having a discussion of a topic or a text or something like that. And it's a back and forth and there is an exchange.
Yeah.
And the excitement that has, not just for me, but like I feel like we have these great conversations sometimes, and so it's not just like a one-way kind of street here either,
Hmm.
right? Where I come in as a Western trained academic and I'm just going to like take stuff, but like you can go in and you can have conversations with people, and sometimes those conversations are really exciting and fruitful.
Hmm. Yeah. That's exciting to hear about. Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I want to get into some of your books and things you've written
Mm.
about. Um, I wonder if I could ask you your sense of Tibet culturally and politically. I'm not even sure how to
Mm.
ask this exactly, just but it's basically a theocratic society, right? Is that fair to
Mm.
say? Like the religion and politics were very intertwined and
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, one of the things about Tibet, right? I mean, it's a complicated place that's been there for a long time.
Hmm.
And I'm always wary of using words like theocratic or something like that, because they have these like formal definitions and things like that. Um, and there were certainly, large chunks of Tibetan history where there is there was we're looking like the Dalai Lamas, right? These sort of very obviously sort of religious figures, either in charge or nominally in charge of the government. But there are also times where the government, may have looked more secular, right? And so it's like, it's just as complex, the sort of this history of the interplay between the quote unquote like religious and the quote unquote secular is just as complicated as it is in many other places. And sometimes they're more joined, sometimes they're less joined. Some regions at one time you might have more, sometimes less. Like it's a complicated sort of political history.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you've written two books related to vegetarianism and Buddhism,
Mhm.
right? And that's, I mean, clearly a passion of yours, and I want to get into
Yeah.
that. What made that a subject of interest for you in particular? And why two books? That seems like a lot.
Well, I feel like the two the two books are complementary. Maybe I'll start with that. The first one, Food of Sinful Demons, is the actual like scholarly monograph, right? That was the result of my primarily initial dissertation work, and that one is my attempt to sort of to really like make sense of the phenomena of vegetarianism as it existed within the Tibetan context. The second book, The Faults of Meat, is actually a compilation. It's an edited volume of translations
Oh,
of primary Tibetan texts, right, that focus on vegetarianism. So that's less of a history and more of like a document source book, and that we had a bunch of amazing translators who contributed to that. So that one is not all my work by any measure.
oh, I see. Yeah.
As much as any work in academia is ever actually one's own, right? We all
Uh,
build on each other constantly, and then we put our name on the final project,
yeah.
but that
Well, that's a
is
good point
very
too,
much
and
a
that's
lie.
yeah, and that's a kind of Buddhist perspective too, that we're all so interconnected and everything's
Yeah,
dependent on our sources and the information we get. And in the West, we have this such an emphasis on individuality and like this
mm,
individual creation. And
yeah,
I'm fascinated by like Tibetan art, for example. They have beautiful Thangka paintings, but they're not
yeah,
like you don't see a giant signature of the artist.
yeah,
It's a traditional thing where the
yeah,
individual creating it is less important, right, than the process.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, definitely, definitely. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And actually, a colleague of mine at D Denver was just talking about this at a book talk of his last night. I haven't read it yet, but it's a really exciting looking book called The Dharma and DNA, I think. But it's, one of his things that he's looking at is he's using sort of Buddhist positions on to critique the idea of like doing science is like the lone gunman out there who's doing
Mm.
science. You get your name on it, and the sort of ego-driven thing. Anyway, that's a
Yeah.
different issue. But yeah, you asked about how I got into vegetarianism, and the short version of it is that I had been vegetarian
Mm.
before doing that, and I had already started working on a dissertation. Doing some background research for a totally different project that I've actually essentially put down and have no interest in anymore. And I was reading the Words of My Perfect Teacher,
Mm.
Patrul Rinpoche's text, just for myself, right? Not for any academic
Yeah. Just
reason.
to
And
share with
he in there,
yeah.
what's that?
I was going to say, just to share with listeners, Words of My Perfect Teacher is kind of this very classic overview of at least the
Mm-hmm.
Nyingma, right? Tibetan Buddhist
Yeah.
tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, really, these ngundro, these preliminary practices, right? But in there, he talks in a couple of points about not eating meat, and
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah,
It's a
and so I
challenging book.
had
There's some things in that book I didn't like. I was like, what? All the hell realms, and you're going to go to hell for
yeah,
like eons, and like people think
totally,
Buddhism is peaceful,
totally.
and it's not always.
Um, and yeah, so I mean, I had now at that point I had lived and worked with Tibetans for a long time, and I knew that most Tibetans ate meat. And so I was kind of curious about this and started wondering if Patrul Rinpoche's work, if was this like the only thing out there or not. And so then I started just sort of looking into that a little bit. And what I really quickly discovered was that actually there was a lot written in Tibetan about being vegetarian or eating meat. And, and that once I sort of discovered that there was stuff here, it was very obvious that was what I should be studying. Right, this was of much more interest to me. It was clearly this is what I want to work on, and so yeah, that was the start of this whole project. And then from there, I don't know how familiar your listeners are with sort of like how the academic process works, right? But in my case, it's like once you have the topic here, then it's like now I got to track down everything I can find on this. And, so I would talk to everyone I could talk to and be like, do you know of any texts on this? Or what do you think about this? And, I was going all over Kham, that is Eastern Tibet, and talking to scholars and Khenpos and monks and lay people and being like, hey, and sometimes they'd be like, oh yeah, there's this text over here in our library. And then they bring it out and I like take pictures of it and go home and work on it. And the thing that the big takeaway from all of that, and this is in some ways like one of the main points of my first book, is simply that, look, this was an issue in Tibet, at least going back 1,000 years, right? Obviously, not all Tibetans were vegetarian, and I like that's clear, right?
It seems like on that point, like, I mean, my perception seems like the minority, like it's an unusual choice.
Yeah, it's a relatively unusual choice. But it was always a choice. And that was sort of the point of really what I was discovering was like, there's a pretty consistent discourse around this question of whether or not it's okay to eat meat that goes back again, at least to the 11th century, right? Maybe earlier, but the earliest like really firmly dated stuff.
Okay. So on that point, are you finding sources from India talking about this?
I mean, there are sources from India, absolutely. But no, I'm thinking primarily
Okay.
Tibetan authors, right? I mean, we have all kinds of sutric material from India, of sometimes more or less questionable provenance, right? But this was clearly an issue in India as well.
Yeah.
Um, and that's sort of really, I mean, anyway, that's sort of the point of it all, really, is that this wasn't a settled issue. Like, it wasn't a non-issue, right? It's
Yeah.
not that nobody worried about it. It's that people went back and forth a lot, and it remained an open question. And so you would have some places where it looks like the evidence suggests that like whole communities were vegetarian,
Yeah.
right? Or other times where it doesn't come up at all, right? And you have other people who are saying things like, well, yeah, it's okay to eat meat, but we really shouldn't enjoy it, or it's not really a great thing. And so you have all of these actually really nuanced perspectives on this question of eating meat. And so this is then what I try to track through the book is three of those perspectives. And I use this this breakdown of the three vows, which are the vows of individual liberation, the pratimoksha, and then the bodhisattva vows, and then these tantric samayas. And so this is sort of the framework that you see in a lot of Tibetan texts on vegetarianism. They'll actually go through and be like, well, according to the pratimoksha, here is what you should think about eating meat. Or according to the bodhisattva vow, here's what you should think about eating meat. And according to the samayas, here's what you should think about eating meat. And one of the things that's interesting is that those are three really different perspectives.
Yeah.
And so you end up with this take, when you're looking at it as a whole, you end up with this position that's actually really complicated. And it's asking people to think through, okay, well, where are you coming from when you ask this question about like, should I eat meat or not?
I just want to say I really appreciate you diving into this topic, and it's complicated and articulating that, and it's not a topic I would have chosen, but I'm glad someone did. I'm glad you did, because I just want to share, I once was talking with a translator of this Tibetan Lama who's like a very loving, compassionate person, and he's like spending most of his day, if not all of his day, talking with people, giving teachings, helping people however he can. And I asked this translator, like, so amazing, he's so giving with his time and energy. Is there ever anything he says that he's like tired of? And she said, well, he did say to me one time he's tired of people asking him if they should eat meat or not.
Yeah, I get that.
He's tired of that question, because that question always comes up, and it's a tough one. Or it's like, how do you? What are you going to say? Like, you can't tell someone what to do all the time. And
yeah, no, I get that. It reminds me a little bit of one lama that I knew, Tibetan lama, who had written a text on vegetarianism, and he went to another, like a higher kind of lama, to give it to him, and he presented it, and the high lama was like, oh no, don't give me that, because if I read that, then I won't be able to eat meat anymore. And so it was like, there's a tension there, right?
yeah,
And it's a tension that, again, like, whatever side that people would end up coming down on, like, it's a real tension that has existed in Tibet, and it's not a new thing.
It's not
right.
new.
Sometimes people are like, oh, it's this like imported thing, or it's Westerners coming and trying to impose, and that's not true at all.
That's
right?
a good point, because I've heard people say that.
Yeah, and it's just not true, right? These discussions about eating meat or not eating meat go way back, and sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less, and sometimes it's surprising the places that there is more. Like, if we look at like early 20th century Kham, right? These Eastern Tibet, these Khampa warrior types and all that, there's actually a lot of vegetarianism going on around there. I can recall I've been fortunate enough to interview a couple of like really old lamas who remember the 30s. And I can just ask and be like, hey, when you were a young monk, was anyone vegetarian? And they're like, oh yeah, lots of people.
Oh, interesting.
And it's like maybe half the monastery. People were, people weren't. I remember one lama was like, it was a totally personal choice. Some people were, some people weren't, and nobody gave anyone grief either way.
That's good to share.
So it's, but that also seems to be one of the like high points in the history of vegetarianism. There was another time in the 15th century, 15th and 16th century, where it seems to have been really quite common, particularly in Sakya and Kagyu circles. And other times it's waxed and waned, right? But it's
Yeah.
always been there. And the question has always been there.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think a kind of common perspective I've heard a lot of people say is, oh, the Tibetans really wanted to be vegetarian, but because of the harsh climate and the limited diet and options, they couldn't be.
Yeah.
But if anyone who's spent time around the Tibetan people, at least in my experience, like they tend to love eating meat. That I mean,
Yeah.
and I
Oh,
don't
yeah,
blame them. I mean,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I want to dive, yeah, into some more of
So
these
I've
issues.
actually got a bit of a funny story about that. So,
Yeah.
one of the things when we, as an academic, when we publish a book, before the publisher will accept it, they send it out to other scholars for review anonymously, right? Although it's not always anonymous because we all know who's working on what. Um, but so in the first draft of Food of Sinful Demons, I had a long discussion about how impossible it was for people to be vegetarian in Tibet, and this, that, and the other. And it got sent out for review. And one of the main comments I got back from a senior colleague was, "Are you sure about that?" And so that actually made me then go back into the literature and see what I could find about, because it's not actually all that easy to discover what people ate on a day-to-day basis. Nobody writes that down, right? People don't usually write down like, okay, today I had this, that, and the other thing. But when I started looking for it, what I realized was that like most people ate meat, but it probably wasn't as much as we might think. You'd see a lot of references to people saying like, oh, hey, today's Thursday, so I put a little bit of meat in my soup. Right, which is
More of a
suggesting
special.
yeah, it's like a little bit of a special thing, right? And so and again, it's different by communities. And if you're a Drokpa, if you're a nomad, you'll probably be eating a lot more meat. But even then, it's primarily a winter, fall, winter, and a little bit into spring. And then in the summer, you'd eat tsampa, right? I mean, this is roasted barley flour was really the cornerstone of the diet.
Yeah. It's such an unusual diet, right? I've heard or read that
Yeah.
Tibetans drink. There was some report of someone who visited Tibet and they're like observed the monks drinking 50 cups of black tea a day, like the butter tea. I'm sure that's
I
an
don't
exaggeration,
think
but
I buy that, but yeah.
drinking a lot
Yeah.
of tea and sampa,
Yeah.
the
And,
barley
and
flour.
you think about that and you think about the amount of butter that gets consumed in there, and that's actually a lot of calories,
Yeah.
right? And it's a lot of protein. And so I'm, no one has a crystal ball. We can't look into the past and like ask people, what did you eat every day? Right. But I'm a little bit more skeptical than some about how much meat was actually in the diet.
Well, so, okay. And that raises the question for me of, we're talking about this traditional culture and people and their diet, and how much of that was choice versus scarcity. Like they're just, was
Yeah.
meat kind of a
A
rare
lot
thing,
of
so it's
that, no, a
special,
lot
or
of
is it a
that,
choice? Yeah.
yeah, a lot of that would be scarcity.
Okay.
Right. And yeah, and so I don't want to, I feel like there's a couple, there's
like
like a couple of
ethically, that's
different
a
things
big
all
difference.
bouncing around here, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, for a lot of people, particularly if you weren't wealthy, meat was probably a semi-rare luxury, right? If you were wealthy, or if you were, again, like, Drokpa, a nomad, and that was what you had, then that's a different story. But I think the point I was trying to make was that there was more non-meat food going around than people sometimes think.
Yeah.
But that also, the flip side of it is almost everybody, all of the texts that I've read, all the people I've, at least the pre-modern, I'll say that, people, pretty much everyone seems to agree that being vegetarian was unhealthy, right? So it was seen as like an ascetic practice, something that you would do like a hardship for the sake of the Dharma.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. So people weren't doing it because they thought it was good for them, right? They were doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do, even though it was harmful, right? There's one great story about, a very early story about a Tibetan Lama who was vegetarian and quite strict about it. And as he got older and was on the verge of dying, his students brought in a doctor who said, here, take this soup. And it was a medicinal soup made out of powdered yak lung. And the Lama refused. He said, nope, I'm not going to eat that, and died. Right. So didn't take the medicine and then died. And it's clear when you read the biography that the students kind of blamed his vegetarianism for, like, they're like, if only he wasn't vegetarian, he would have lived a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's pretty clear that being vegetarian in Tibet was seen as a hardship, right? It wasn't, it was morally good, but also difficult and not great for your body. And so there's very much that sense of it as like a hardship for the Dharma.
Yeah. Well, so that's good. And that was the point I wanted to raise. And I realize we're bouncing around a bit, but just in terms of ethical questions here, there's the question, is it ethical to eat meat or not? And then there's the separate question, what is the best thing that's healthiest for my body, in this time and situation? And ideally, those would go together, but maybe they don't. And I think a lot of people feel that, I feel more energized, I feel healthier when I eat meat, and yet I feel bad about the animals. So there's a tension for a lot of people for these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I'll say these days, it varies very much by the person, right? I've known a lot of people who will say they feel healthier or more energized when they stop eating meat.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, in Tibet, this was definitely something that people wrestled with, and it wasn't an obvious choice. And particularly if you were like a religious leader, you're, in some ways you're balancing like, okay, a desire to not cause harm against a desire to stick around a little bit longer and keep teaching, right? And what's the morally sort of correct thing to do in that context? And different people made different choices. There are other biographies that talk about someone who's normally vegetarian choosing to eat meat when they're ill, right, as a medicinal thing. And there are other texts that are sort of normally adamantly vegetarian that are like, okay, but if you're sick, we'll make an exception.
Yeah.
Right. If you're sick and ill, you can eat it, but you have to eat it as medicine. Right. And that's one of the things that actually comes up a lot is texts will tell people, like, if you're going to eat meat, make sure you don't enjoy it. Right. There's a sense of like, you have to eat it as medicine, like with the same kind of attitude as if you were like eating your mother or something like that you would only do in dire circumstances.
Basically, traditional Tibetan medicine, meat is considered healthy and, like you were saying, a part of a lot of the medical treatment.
Yeah, it's considered part of what we would call a balanced diet, right? And a way of keeping these sort of the humors, I guess is the English that they often use for this, in the body in balance. Yeah, so that's definitely a thing in traditional Tibetan medicine. And one of the things that's interesting is that as ideas about medicine shift, like I've interviewed a lot of people these days in Tibet, a lot of Tibetans in Kham and other places, who point around and say, oh, you see that how like obese that person is because they eat so much meat. And so these attitudes towards the health of meat have changed, or are changing, at least in some pockets, in some communities. Again, can't speak for everybody, and there are going to be plenty of other Tibetans who are like, oh my God, without meat, you can't do anything. But there are people out there where that attitude changes.
It's fascinating how different cultures have different attitudes and beliefs around health and well-being, and one of them is, I think, in my understanding, like traditionally in China and Tibet, like being bigger would be a sign of wealth and health, and in modern day America, being thin and fit, is like
it changes. Certainly, in some contexts, at least, that was definitely seen as being a good thing.
Also, and this thing around not enjoying meat, is that connected with karma?
I think it's one of the chapters in the book I call a necessary evil. And that's actually taken from a quote from this nun, Urgyen Choki, 18th century nun. And I think the idea with not enjoying it is like, she says, like, when I put goat's meat in my mouth, I feel sad, right? But set in this human body, I need this food. And so there's a sense in her writing that, eating meat is like she's recognizing it as a negative act, right? Something that's not good from the perspective of the Dharma, but also something that she feels is necessary, right? And so it's this thing that she has to do that's not a good thing, but it's a necessary thing. And I think that's what's being invoked when, like, a Lama will write about how if you're going to eat meat, you have to, don't enjoy it, right? Think of it as your mother. It's because it's like, okay, if you're going to do this, you have to do it, or they would say you should do it from the perspective of, this is a regrettable thing that I have to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Not a position of, here's something I'm going to enjoy.
Right. Okay, well, two questions for you real quick. One is, I've read and heard that there was a small Muslim population in Tibet, and they would be given the job of butchering the animals so that the Tibetan Buddhists
Yeah.
didn't have to actually kill the animals.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, that was a thing, at least in some places, right?
Okay.
Particularly in Lhasa. And, if there were Muslims around who were willing to do this, the actual act of butchering and killing the animal is pretty consistently seen as a deeply sinful thing, a deeply negative thing to do. There was often a very strong sense of a disconnect between the actual killing of the animal and then the eating of the meat. And so a sense of like, oh, the butcher is this horrible person who does all of this bad stuff. But once he's killed the animal, then I just go and buy the meat, and that's no problem. Right. And that's rooted in this Vinaya precept known as the rule of threefold purity. And that rule says that a monk who is like out, and it's in the Vinaya, so probably it's talking about monks who like would go out on daily begging rounds.
They would beg for food.
Right. So a monk who goes out and begs for food, if they're given meat, right, that they have no reason to think that animal was killed for them, then they're allowed to eat it. And so there's this sense of like a disconnect between the meat and the killing. And then there were other Tibetans who really questioned that, right? And
most modern people would question that logic, but yeah.
I think, a lot of folks would, and a lot of, quote unquote pre-modern Tibetans did too. Okay. My favorite story of that quote from that comes from Jigme Lingpa, who has this awesome story where a hunter is out in the mountains and he comes across a hermit, right? Living in a cave up there. And the hermit is yelling at him and being like, oh, you're so bad. You're so bad. You go and kill these animals and stuff like that. And the thing that's awesome about this, and, this is Jigme Lingpa, right, who's writing this. He says, oh, the hunter responds and chews out the hermit. And the hunter says, you're a hypocrite, right? Because it might be hunters like me who do the actual killing, but we only do it because you and all of your other so-called renunciates buy the meat from us, right? And so, they go back and forth for a while, and eventually the hermit wins the argument and the hunter gives up his sinful lifestyle. Yeah. But sort of along the way, the hermit is forced to admit that, the hunter's right.
Well, yeah.
Like that, it's not just on the hunter, it's also on the people buying the meat that are motivating the hunter to go out and hunt. Mm-hmm. And so there's an awareness there, right? And this is another one of these kind of contested spaces, right? And so some Tibetan authors are really clear that if you buy meat in a butcher shop, you are totally morally separate from the death of the animal, right? You have no karmic connection there. Others are like, that's dumb. Like, look at this, right? Like if the monks in the monastery didn't go buy the meat from the butcher shop, the butcher wouldn't kill animals.
Yeah, so logical. Yeah.
So you had people making both claims, right?
Yeah.
Both have scriptural, and I'll say they both have scriptural grounding, right?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
The threefold purity side pulls on this rule of threefold purity in the Vinaya, and then the people who are like, but there's this like economic causation going on. Would usually quote the Lankavatara Sutra and the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, both of which explicitly say that someone buying the meat is equally culpable.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's in the sutra. Yeah. Yeah, I've always been inspired with the simplicity and the beauty of the, original historical Buddha, at least according to the
Mm.
tradition and stories, like begging for food and just eating
Mhm.
whatever was put in the bowl, even up until the point of eating poison food that killed him at the end of his life, which you
Yeah.
could
Well, there's also
understand that
debate
differently.
about what that
Yeah,
was, right?
right.
Yeah.
But I have never met, I don't think I've ever met a single person in my life who really was living that lifestyle.
Yeah.
We're in a modern capitalist world where we use money to get things, and so you have some
Mm.
responsibility for how you use the money. What do
Yeah.
you think, real quick,
I
about?
think I mean, people, I feel like there are people out there. There's just
Okay,
not a lot of them.
yeah, just
Yeah.
yeah. What do you think
Yeah.
about? I imagine a lot of people listening to this, like a lot of people I know, they eat meat, but they make a real effort to buy meat that's more humanely raised, that's
Right.
not with antibiotics, and then they feel better about it, and that has logic. That makes sense to me.
Mhm.
Like, what do you think about that in the Buddhist context?
I mean, I think so. One of the things I like about the Tibetan tradition here, right, and this is that it's less black and white than we sometimes get in the U.S., right? Um, it's like when we talk about the US, it's like, oh, are you vegetarian? Are you vegan? Are you pescatarian? Right? There's all these sort of kind of fixed labels. And what I get in the Tibetan tradition is more of a sense of eating meat is bad because it causes harm,
Mm,
right? It causes the death of these animals. So the more you can do to reduce that harm, the better. And
mm,
so the ideal then would be like, okay, don't eat any meat. But if you can't do that, right, if you feel like meat is necessary, then there's like other stuff you can do
mm,
that is not quite like full-blown vegetarian. Like you can not eat meat in the mornings, right? For a while, I don't know if it's still
mm,
going, there was a movement in Tibet called Lakar, where people would not eat meat on Wednesday
mm.
because that was His Holiness the Dalai Lama was born on Wednesdays. And so there was this whole like, take Wednesday and make it a really good day kind of thing. Um, and so there's lots of different ways there, but the emphasis is less on adhering to a label and more simply on do what you can do to reduce the suffering of the animal.
Mm.
And
It's a good
so if
principle.
that's the model, then I would be all for anything that we can do that reduces harm. While also recognizing that
Hmm.
eating, farm raised, grass raised beef, they still kill those cows,
Right.
right? And they still die in a way that most of us would find pretty horrific,
Mm,
right? Like there's a herd, I live a little bit out in the country, there's a herd of cows that live up the road from me, and I go and hang
mm,
out with them sometimes. And yeah, they are all destined for the slaughterhouse,
mm,
right? Now, am I glad that they live out here in these woods behind my house rather than on some like CAFO confined animal feeding
mm.
operation? Is what industrial agriculture, where they're all packed into a building. And yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm so much happier that they're out in the woods eating grass and interacting with each other in a relatively free and open kind of way. Um, but I'd also rather they weren't going to get slaughtered at the
Yeah.
end
Yeah.
of the day, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, great, right? All for it. Anything that we're doing to reduce suffering in the world, as far as I can tell, is a good thing. Um,
That's a good principle to reduce suffering. What do you think about the ethical argument? And I don't know if I'll do it justice, but to give a thumbnail version of it, that because humans eat chickens, say for example, then there's billions of chickens on this earth that wouldn't
yeah,
exist if humans weren't raising them and then eating them. And so
yeah,
there's a certain ethical value to the fact that all these chickens get to exist versus in the natural state there would just be maybe, I don't know, a few million. Just to,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, so I don't know how much you know about industrial animal agriculture, but chickens live horrible
Mm,
lives, right? I mean, it's really brutal the way a chicken lives these days.
mm,
Um, Chickens and pigs are about the worst, right? Or all, I should say,
oh,
all
really?
poultry,
Yeah.
turkeys as well. Cows, relatively high percentage of cows actually live outside. Most chickens never see daylight
Mm,
in their entire lives. And I guess I find it hard to think that just that kind of existence is in and of itself a good thing, right? I mean, if we're looking at it from kind of a Buddhist perspective, that is not a life, a birth that I would wish on anybody,
Wow.
right? It feels far closer to the hell realms than the chicken that pecks around in the grain outside in your neighbor's yard. I mean, that's this minuscule proportion of the number of chickens that are raised every year in the US. So, I don't know. I guess that argument doesn't feel like it holds a lot of weight to me.
I think I agree with you. What about, real quick, the idea of lab-raised meat that could be grown in a petri dish and no
Awesome.
consciousness attached to
I mean,
it? Okay.
I feel like, if to my mind, if they're growing meat in a petri dish somehow, then that means that there are less animals like with consciousness that have to live that kind of a horrible life. Awesome. I'm all for it, right? I mean, one of the things that often happens, I think, with people who've been vegetarian for a long time, and often not always, right, but certainly with myself, is like, the very idea becomes kind of gross when you get distance from it. So I personally would not want to eat that. In the same way, I don't want to eat eggplant because eggplant's gross, right? It's just not appealing to me. But as on principle, yeah, awesome, right? That would be, again, it's like anything we do that reduces suffering, sweet, right? And just like Beyond Burgers and the Impossible Burger, right? It's not really my thing. But if it helps people eat less beef, then that sounds like a great plan to me.
Yeah. Well, this conversation, I wonder if some people will see the title of this episode and avoid it, because now I'm being forced to confront this difficult issue and my own choices. And, I eat meat and have mixed feelings about it and been vegetarian through phases and times, but it's tough there's such a separation, I feel like, for most of us on a day-to-day basis between the lives those animals live and our choice to buy and consume their meat. So,
Julian, I think if there's one thing that I actually like, that I would like to have happen from my work, it would be to reduce that separation, right? I don't want to make choices for people. I don't want to tell people what they should or shouldn't do. I don't think I've ever told someone that they should be vegetarian, right? I feel like that's none of my business and not my place to say. But if I can, like, if the work that I do and stuff like that helps get people to think more critically about where their meals come from, and gets them to have, if you're going to go have a chicken sandwich, have it not be just something that you do, but something that you think about and make a decision about.
Right.
That would be awesome. I feel like I would feel very pleased with that.
Absolutely.
Kind of a success.
Yeah, it's interesting how, this is another big topic, but just in our world today, like, Amazon is maybe the quintessential extreme example of one click buying things. We're totally separate from the process of creating that thing that you just bought and the cost of getting it from where it was made to your home. And there's a lot of convenience there, but there's this separation, there's this alienation. And I think that there's deeper costs to it than most of us pay attention to, where we don't feel satisfied, honestly, we don't feel connected, we're not,
I suspect you're right. And I sometimes feel like I struggle with an Amazon addiction.
Yeah, me too.
And you're talking about going through waves where you're vegetarian or not, and I'll cancel my Prime subscription for a while, right? And then something will come up, and I'll be like, oh, okay, I'll just this month, right, to order something, and it's a challenge, absolutely, yeah.
So I'm back with you, and we're doing a little follow-up because some more questions came up, and we ran out of time last time. So I'll add this on at the end of our last conversation.
Sounds good. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, good to see you again. And I will say that our conversation last time has had me thinking about and reflecting on the whole thing of eating meat and environmental impact and what is causing more or less suffering. And so I have been eating less meat and being more intentional about it, and that's felt good to me. So
yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that. I think it's a complicated issue, and yeah, I don't know if I said this last time, but I often feel like like, I'm not trying to push a particular stance, but I'm always happy when people think about it, right? More than we
Yeah.
sometimes do. So,
Yeah, I think it's good to think
yeah.
about. I guess maybe we can just start off with that a little bit because
Yeah.
I've often gotten into discussions around this with other Buddhists or meditators or just people in general, and I generally will agree. Like it's like when I actually think about it logically, it's better to you're going to be causing less suffering if you're not eating meat, if you're not supporting factory agriculture, um, and so yeah, to bring my own behavior more in alignment with that. And then I think for a lot of people, and we touched on this some, like from the viewpoint of Tibetan medicine, they often recommend eating meat for health or for, so there's often this like sense of conflict of like, I don't want to eat meat, but I feel healthier or, it might be better for me individually. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts like from, as like a Buddhist, someone who's studying the Buddhist teachings from a more scholarly point of view about that? Like how people would?
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of going back to what we talked about last time. I mean, I think fundamentally there are a lot of arguments here from a Buddhist side, sort of in favor of vegetarianism, right? From a sort of a core compassion basis. Um, but there's also lots of other stuff going on. You mentioned the medical perspectives and the sense that a lot of people have that if I don't eat meat, I won't be healthy. And I've had a lot of conversations personally, right, outside of the Buddhist world, just in general, with people who feel very strongly that, without meat, their body, they won't be healthy. And I'm not going to sit here and, tell them that they're wrong. Like, I'm not a doctor, that's not my
Hmm.
business. So that's definitely an important part, factor in this conversation. And also beyond that, there's other things going on, cultural things, right? Like, it can be really a difficult thing for someone to go to Thanksgiving with their grandparents
Hmm.
and say, no, I'm not eating the turkey with you,
Right.
right?
Yeah, that's
Like
a big thing too.
that's a really hard stance to take with your family. And so all of these things kind of get put into balance, against each other. And it's a individual, I mean, there at some point it becomes a real individual choice.
Yeah.
I think I said this last time, but I'm not sure. But one of the things that I've always liked about the Tibetan perspective on meat eating is that I feel like more flexibility in it than we sometimes get in the US, because it's less about like adherence to a defined diet, right? It's less about, do you meet the standards of being a vegetarian or a vegan or a pescatarian, or, you know, adopting some one of those and then adamantly sticking to it. And there's a little more flexibility, a little more sense of like people who are like, yeah, most of the time I'm vegetarian, but sometimes there are exceptions, and
Yeah.
there's room for that
I like
without being
that.
dismissive. And I've always kind of liked that. Like, and so sometimes you get people who are, vegetarian on Wednesdays.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you know, I've known people in the US who would be really dismissive of that, right? Like,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
that's, whatever. But from the Tibetan perspective, it's like, well, that's better than nothing.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
so
I think that's a
there's like,
really important thing.
there's
And
a,
yeah.
yeah. And there's also a recognition that honestly, like, we can't escape. It's not like we're going to have no harm, right?
Right.
No matter what kind of diet, like, our basic existence in the world causes harm. And so the goal is to minimize it as much as we can. Right. At least that's what I think,
I like
that's
that.
my read on
Yeah.
the Buddhist take. And so, as someone living in the United States right now, it's quite easy for me to be vegetarian, and there's not really much hardship there at all. And so that feels like low hanging fruit to me,
Hmm.
but that's me and not someone else. And so, we're all, that's my take, at least on the sort of like the Buddhist perspectives here, is that we're all
Yeah.
trying to reduce the suffering around us, and whatever we can do to do that is better. But we're also imperfect, and
Hmm.
our compassion isn't, until we become enlightened, our compassion is not going to be perfect, and we're not going to know always exactly what to do, and we're not always going to be able to do the things that we think we should do, right?
Right.
Because we're humans, and
Yeah.
we're kind of messy creatures.
I appreciate that perspective. Yeah. Kind of building up to asking you this big question this is part of the
Yeah.
reason that inspired our follow-up. But I just wanted to talk about this. And I really appreciate and value that perspective of reducing harm. And actually, if we study the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha Dharma, it talks about not identifying, like transcending our ego, our ego clean, our identity, and our, finding the middle way. And so I think there's actually something really profound and powerful about, how like people will latch onto an identity. I'm a vegan, and and it becomes on some level a source of suffering, right? That's what the Buddhist teachings are kind of saying, when your identity gets really wrapped up with something, versus like, let's, reduce harm. Let's remember the reasons why we're doing it, so that that identity doesn't become a reason to attack other people or feel superior or all that stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, that certainly can happen. I've also known lots of vegans who are not, who don't do that. So I don't want to,
yeah.
if I don't want to fall into stereotypes on either kind of side of
Yeah.
this,
Well, I
right?
think another point is that if you can, like, having a rigid category, like you're either vegetarian or you're not, that kind of rigid
Mhm.
black and white thinking isn't as helpful as, like, yeah, someone, like, if someone gives up meat for 2 days a week, that's awesome. Like that kind of
Yeah.
attitude, it encourages, actually has a more beneficial effect versus thinking, oh, I'm not vegetarian, so it doesn't matter. Like, no, it still matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
It's like, even if you're not going to be like completely vegetarian or completely vegan or whatever, to my mind at least, the act of cutting back, that's beneficial, right?
yeah.
The act of, meatless Mondays was a thing. I'm not sure how often people still do that, but that
Oh, yeah.
was a thing that people did, was to be, vegetarian or vegan on Mondays. And that was, that's great.
Yeah.
Right. Or trying to, actively trying to only eat meat that was raised in, relatively humane standards. Right. That's good.
Yeah.
Right. That's better than sort of thoughtlessly going out and, eating a fast food hamburger without,
Yeah.
any consideration for, the Amazon that's getting chopped down to produce
Yeah.
that really, really ridiculously cheap beef.
Yeah, so much better than not caring. I think we need to care
Yeah.
when it actually matters. And
And
if eating a
just
little bit of
making a
meat
choice.
gives you energy and helps you do good things in the world, like, that's good too. So,
Yeah.
um, great. Um, okay, well, here's the question I emailed you about, and you're like, let's meet again and talk about it because it's a big issue. So I've heard, without naming names,
Mhm.
some Tibetan lamas and practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism in this country express the viewpoint of, that if if you're a genuine meditator, something like Dzogchen, like this kind of high meditation teachings, you eat meat with that kind of view, that you're actually creating a karmic connection with that animal that will benefit them. That you can then connect, that they will then be able, that stream of consciousness of that being that you're eating will be able to connect with the Dharma, will be able to become enlightened, or could be reborn in a pure land. And if you don't eat the meat of that animal, then the chances of that happening are very slim, according to this
Mhm.
worldview. Obviously, this
Right.
worldview requires a belief in reincarnation, and that
Yeah.
we're connecting with that stream of consciousness. So,
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely heard this, and this was one of the sort of the sort of the first rationales for eating meat that I came up with, or that I you know was told. Um, and the thing, so I mean, there's sort of a couple of things, I guess, to say about it. The first is that I've looked a lot to find this kind of a like textual authority for this kind of a claim, and I haven't found it. Right. So this is something I've heard people say. It's not something I've ever seen like written and propounded in a textual source.
oh, interesting.
If anybody listening to this knows of like a place in a Tibetan text where this is, you know, please let me know. Right. I
Yeah.
would actually love to find that. What I have found in Tibetan sources is Tibetan lamas arguing against this point.
Oh,
And so it's sort of like, we know that people must have said, we know that people must have said something like this because there are lamas arguing against it, right? And the usual position that those lamas would take would be something along the lines of like, maybe, sure, right? Like maybe somebody theoretically, could make a positive karmic connection with an animal by eating them. And if you're going to eat meat, then yes, you should certainly try to make the aspiration to make that connection. But then these lamas will go on and they'll say, but why can't you make that connection without killing the animal? Right?
huh.
Why can't you walk out into the field of cows and make the aspiration prayers and connect with those cows in such a way that they're bound to you, and that you create this relationship with them, so that in the future, they can be born as your students or something like that, right? That, there's the suggestion being that there's not actually much in, the act of killing that is going to help this whole process happen. The other thing, honestly, that comes up in a number of texts, and these are not this is not an opinion by inconsequential people. The texts the first comes to mind is by Jigme Lingpa, right? One of these really authoritative and foundational Nyingma lamas, who said, yeah, maybe someone can do this, but then, and this is Jigme Lingpa saying, he says, but I can't, right? And so I can't do that, right? And then maybe we should, and then he continues and says, maybe we should have an honest conversation with ourselves about where our abilities actually are, right? And I know another text that I read said, yeah, this is possible, it might happen, but in order to be like that powerful, a tantric lama, you have to also have the ability to bring the animal back from the dead.
Oh, wow.
So if you can snap your fingers and revive the corpse of the animal, and of course there are stories about Tibetan lamas who could do this, right? Like Do Khyentse is famously, Do Khyentse and Patrul Rinpoche, and Patrul, sort of classically understood to be vegetarian or largely vegetarian. Patrul goes to Do Khyentse's camp, and Do Khyentse kills a sheep, and Patrul Rinpoche is like, yep, all good. And Patrul's students are like, what? And Do Khyentse is like, yeah, no, it's all good, because, and he snaps his fingers, and like the sheep comes back to life. Wow. Right? The corpse of the sheep is reanimated and runs off and is doing fine, and they're all sitting there eating their meat. So, there's also a tradition that says like, okay, if you can actually do that, then all bets are off, right? But the thing that both of these kind of arguments ask is they ask us to make like a realistic appraisal of our own abilities, right? And to really think about, am I able to make the kind of a connection with this animal that requires me to kill it, right? Am I eating meat as out of compassion, or is this kind of like an excuse, right? And that kind of connects with another argument that you see sometimes, where, especially in like a medical context, where it's like, okay, if you're going to eat meat because you think it's necessary for your body, you really shouldn't be enjoying it. Like you should be eating it with sadness. And they often, like the text will sometimes say, like, you should eat it with like the feeling that you're eating your child, right? Or that you're eating your parent. And so you should they'll actually, some of these texts will say, like, if you're going to eat meat, you should be crying, right? You should be that like distressed about this, but you have to do it. So you need to do it, right? And again, all of this, what this is all kind of boiling down to is to try to I think, discourage people from using their status as, a tantric practitioner or something like that as an excuse to actually just go and do what they want to do. Yeah. Right. And they're actually eating the meat because they enjoy meat, right? But not purely out of this altruistic motivation to create a connection.
Yeah, it's good to be honest. That's interesting. It's fascinating. So another viewpoint I've heard expressed that might sound odd to people outside the Buddhist world, but I remember being on a retreat at like a Dzogchen retreat center and people talking about this, is that every single sentient being, every single animal or insect or bug is equal in the sense of having Buddha nature and equal in the sense of, going through the cycles of death and rebirth. And so if you are going to eat meat, it's better to eat like one big animal, because then you're just killing one thing instead of a bunch of little ones. And also this idea that if you're eating rice or wheat or grains, like millions of insects were killed in the creation of like threshing the fields and the process of refining the grains. And so actually, no matter what you're eating, like millions of sentient beings have died for that. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the second part goes back to kind of what I was saying before, that we can't survive without causing harm, right? And if you're eating any crops that were grown, there's going to be harm caused there, right? I think the question then is like, how much harm and of what type? And and then the second point, I guess the first point you made is something that I've heard a lot, that a larger, more complicated animal is worse to kill, or it's better to kill a large animal than a small one. On the flip side, I have heard people say that it's better to that it's worse to kill a larger, complicated animal because the suffering that
that makes sense
entails
to me
is
because
worse.
their nervous system is more developed. They're more.
The nervous system is more developed. We can assume that they might have a stronger sense of self-identity.
Yeah.
If you look at cows, for instance, and cows are my classic example because they're like, I watch them and see them every day. But if you look at cows, they have very tight emotional bonds with other members of their herd. So when you kill a cow, it's not just the death of the animal where their suffering is happening. When you kill a calf, the mother cow is going to be suffering the loss of their child.
Important.
And it would be ridiculous to think that the mother doesn't feel that, right? Like when you kill like a steer, it would be ridiculous to think that their friends don't feel loss.
Yeah,
because
that's a good point. Yeah.
Why wouldn't they, right? I see them that they have friendships, right? And particular friendships, not like they're not all units, right? They're not like all interchangeable with each other. They know each other. They like have friendships with each other. They have familiar relationships with each other. And so all of this, comes into these kinds of questions. On the flip side, we got to eat. And I don't know anybody in the Buddhist side who's going to go, and be like, oh, stop eating and starve, right? The consensus overall is that, we're gonna, whatever we do, whatever food we consume, it's imperfect. It's going to cause some harm, but vegetables are better than meat.
Yeah.
Right. You cause less harm when you eat vegetables than when you eat meat. I'll just say from like a contemporary science perspective, if you look at the amount of grass that has to get grown, like if the concern is, for instance, the number of insects that are killed, it takes like 10 times as much land to grow a cow than it does to grow a crop.
It's a great point.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if we're completely taking the death of the cow out of the picture, we're talking about 10 times as much acreage required, and thus 10 times as many insects that are killed to raise a cow than to, raise the equivalent calories in soybeans.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it raises this point that I've thought about before in the past of like one big difference I see between like if we want to call it the pre-modern world, where a lot of these Buddhist teachings are coming out of, and our modern contemporary world. We have obviously knowledge of our whole planet and the size of it and this impact on a global environmental scale, things like climate change that we need to take into account. We need to think about, we need to do stuff about it. And in the past that wasn't in the consciousness. They weren't thinking on that scale. Yeah.
Yeah. And things change, and, the tradition changes also. And I think about in traditional Tibet, you never would have had industrial slaughterhouses, right? When an animal was killed, it would have been done at home, small scale for reasonably local consumption. The advent of slaughterhouses in the Tibetan plateau has made people go ballistic.
Oh, really?
Right. And so, there's a very strong anti-slaughterhouse movement, right? With people refusing to sell animals to industrial slaughter, even when home slaughter is allowed. And so people often feel like there's a strong dividing line there between killing your yak at home and sending it in a truck to one of these industrial facilities. Yeah. And so, the tradition is adapting, and it's recognizing that there's a new context that didn't used to exist. And that new context might actually be kind of horrible for the animals.
Because there's going to be increased suffering on the truck ride, and then just the whole thing of it is increasing suffering. I think that's such an important point. And the tradition changes and it evolves. And
if you accept the argument that, if the person killing the yak, for instance, is doing so with, regret and a sense of compassion and goodwill towards the animal, maybe even saying prayers for the animal, if you accept that that's actually good for the yak, that is definitely not happening in a slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
Right. That is not part of the standard slaughterhouse.
And it raises this really important point that I think we touched on when we talked before, but just that our modern world in the West, here in America, more increasingly in the world at large, is so separated from death, so separated from the
Mm,
consequences of our actions. I think we were talking about that with Amazon, but
yeah.
in the traditional societies, when they were talking about slaughtering an animal, you would see the animal,
Yeah.
you would be in that world, and we're so separated. We just, it's out there in the grocery store.
Yeah,
Right? So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, people buy buy their chicken wings under cellophane in the grocery store and have no sense that, just a couple of weeks ago that was clucking around and, living a probably horrible kind of life.
Mm.
Right. And then the companies marketing it throw pictures of happy chickens on the top of their, on their packaging. And it's
Yeah.
like, that's a lie, right? That is not what the life that these chickens led. I have to say, I'm always amused when I'm driving. Amused, I don't know if that's the right word. And you see, like a barbecue joint with a big smiling pig with a
Oh,
fork
yeah.
in it. And you're sitting here like, what are we actually promoting here? Are we talking about pig cannibalism? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the what is this? Why does the pig seem happy? Because honestly, I don't
Yeah.
think the pigs involved in this situation are enjoying it very much. And so there's all kinds of things that we do to increase that separation
Yeah.
between the reality of the act of slaughter, right, and then later on the consumption. It's like we do what we can as much as we can, and consumer culture and these giant corporations that run all of this stuff, they work real hard to make that separation happen, right? That's why
Oh, yeah.
it's illegal. In many places we have these what they call ag-gag laws, right? So that it's illegal to go into a facility and record
Hmm.
how the chickens or the pigs are living, because these companies, they want you to think that it's all like green acres on a farm.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of work has gone into separating
Yeah.
people, the sense of what they eat, from the realities of the lives of the animals and their slaughter.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a more sane world, those laws would be the opposite. We would actually be encouraged to look at the consequences of how the thing that we're purchasing, like how it got to us, right? If we
Yeah,
understood that better, we can make better choices, because a lot of people are nice people. They're good people. They want to do good in the world. And we're just
yeah,
created this structure where it's possible to go through your whole day and be a good, well-intentioned person and never face the reality behind so many of our choices, like the gas pump, where did that gas
yeah,
come from, or the Amazon
exactly.
purchase, who made those clothings, or the
Yep,
chickens, the cows, all the stuff you're talking about, of course. Yeah, so
yep. I mean, that's absolutely true, right? Like, we've created a world where we can glide through without having to think about a lot of the consequences of doing the stuff that we like doing.
yeah, kind of it makes me think about karma and like like
Mhm.
if we're creating lots of negative karma, that's going to have negative consequences, and ignorance isn't really an excuse. And then if we just look at it scientifically, like, cause and
Mhm.
effect, creating we have climate change, we have this huge crisis happening. It's almost like it's possible to see those as kind of getting to the same thing through different
Yeah,
ways. Yeah.
no, I think absolutely. One of the things about karma theory is that they often say, like, once once you have an accurate assessment of a situation, your obligation goes up.
Oh, well.
Like, you can't plead ignorance anymore, right? And so, yeah, right. Once we know the impact of buying a shirt from Amazon and all these things, we have some extra level of obligation, I think, to think about what we're doing and to do our best with the knowledge. Again, like, I feel like I want to come back to this point we talked about at the beginning of the second conversation with us, that yeah, like, we're all imperfect, and we're all causing harm left, right, and center all day. And it's to my mind, it's a question of trying to do what we can to minimize. And you know,
Totally.
sometimes it's like, I got to put gas in my truck,
Yeah. Yeah,
even
totally.
though I know that doing that is a harmful act for the
That's a
world.
tough one. Yeah.
But still, like, I just drove to California and back,
Oh, yeah.
right, to go to a conference.
Oh,
And
cool.
like, Yeah, I used up a bunch of gas to do that.
It's the
And
world we live in. Yeah.
it's the world, we can't escape all of it.
Yeah, I hope
But we
that,
do, but we can do what we can, right? And
yeah,
we
do what
can
we
think
can.
about these things. And I can think about trying to ride my bike more, right? When it's a feasible thing, right? I can think
Yeah.
about it and I can do the things when I can.
Yeah, I think this conversation's given me this like perspective, this attitude I want to cultivate for myself of like, yeah, let's think about this, let's look at it, and let's do the best we can, and let's, I can make some better choices, but it's not going to be helpful to like have a bunch of regret or negativity around past choices, or it's not up to me. It's also we're
Yeah.
in these huge systems. I can't. Sometimes people
Yeah.
put too much weight on the individual, so we just find a balance there. And
I
if
mean, I
this
think that
conversation
that's,
helps you make some better choices, that's awesome, right? It's like,
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the way you just put it is great, right? That's sort of exactly, I feel like where we're at, right? And where we are, like as Buddhists, what we're sort of like, what the tradition is kind of pushing us towards,
hmm,
right?
interesting. Yeah, I guess another thing that, and we can wrap up, but I think Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, and Christianity, a lot of religions, they have a big emphasis on human life. And
Mm.
there is actually a valuing of human life over other life forms in a sense that humans are special, and if we had to choose between killing a bunch of animals and saving a human, like the moral thing would be to save the human, generally speaking. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of?
Oh, I have many thoughts, Julian. This, however, is a topic for another day.
Oh, is it different? Okay.
This is actually a lot of my current work,
Okay. Yeah.
sort of philosophical work, is focused on thinking about the sort of the human animal distinction in Buddhism. And so
Oh,
I've
cool.
got a whole bunch of stuff coming out over the next couple of years that'll be about this. And so maybe we'll hold on to this topic for a little while, because it's actually really complicated. And
Hmm.
Buddhism has a lot to say actually on what the difference between a human and an animal is. And the thing that makes it sort of really interesting, I think, from my perspective, is a lot of what Buddhism has to say is actually really complicated by our increasing awareness of animals' sentience and
Hmm.
mental capacities, and the fact that animals are actually way smarter than humans have assumed that they were.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that simple fact actually throws some huge wrenches into Buddhist theory surrounding the human animal distinction, what it means to be human, what it means to be an animal. And then based on that, like what our moral obligations to animals are,
Hmm.
right? Because if we assume that animals are really dumb and incapable of, critical thought, is often held up as like the characteristic thing about being human, right? And if we accept that animals actually have a lot of that too, which contemporary science is saying they do, then that kind of shifts the analysis, I think, a bit. At least that's what I think. And
Yeah.
those are the arguments that I'm in the process of sort of working up. And yeah, maybe in a couple of years when
Uh-huh.
some of that stuff comes out, we can come back and
Yeah,
can have
that'd be
another
great.
conversation about this.
I'd love that. Yeah, I really appreciate how deeply you are thinking about these issues, and that, it matters, and they're worth thinking about. And I've heard several really prominent neuroscientists say something like, "We're just great apes walking around." That's it's not
You know,
scientifically no difference. So
yeah, I'll say I'll leave you with a little bit of something that has always kind of amused me, at least as soon as it's amused me since I started to recognize it. And we see all of these articles that in the newspaper, right? If you start to look for these, you'll start to see them all the time, where it says something like "gray parrots use money," right? That was a recent one I saw, right? Where these scientists have like established that gray parrots can use money, essentially, right? They can create a unit of measure that they use as a vehicle of exchange between each other, the same way that we use money, right? Or you like ravens have funerals, and like, yeah, but all these things, but the tone in these articles is always surprise,
right,
like it's like
right.
shock, right? It's like, oh my God, our minds are blown. Animals think. Right? Oh my God, like animals have emotions like we do.
Uh-huh.
And the thing that I always keep thinking about is, well, shouldn't that be obvious to
Yeah.
us? Like, why are we surprised when some scientist is like, oh my gosh, animals experience love, right? Or animals use speech. And we're like, why is this so surprising? Because at its core, we're just animals,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we're just another kind of animal. And at least from a Buddhist perspective, like if you're coming at this from like a Christian perspective, for instance, there are plenty of people who have said, no, we're not just animals, right? We have a soul. We have this rational soul, as Descartes puts it, right? And there are a bunch of important Christian thinkers who made this argument, like Augustine, Aquinas. We are different than animals, right? And that's a categorical difference. Buddhism doesn't really have that to fall back on. And so from like a Buddhist perspective, it's a difference of practicalities, right? Like how much more smart are we, right? How much more emotionally intelligent are we? And that's less black and white, right? So from that kind of perspective, I feel like we should be shifting the whole assumption around. And instead of assuming that animals are not like us until proven that they are, and then being surprised about it, we should assume that animals are a lot like us, maybe until proven that they're not. And then the surprise.
Especially the mammals, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you want to talk about octopi, maybe, okay, like that's a whole other thing. But yeah, if we're looking at the cows out there, why should I be surprised that they have families?
Yeah.
Right? Shouldn't I assume that they have a family and then be surprised, like save my surprise for the discovery that they do something different than I do?
Yeah, right? That's a great point.
It's like this. I always kind of like laugh a little bit, and I'll admit to getting a little bit annoyed at times by this tone of surprise in these articles that we read about animal sentience. And it's like, yeah, come on, they're smart. We get it. Like we should know this by now.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think there's a lot of clickbait, and like they try to have the titles of those articles get you to click on them and blah blah blah. But yeah, there's just
absolutely
the roots of what you're talking about are so deep, right? And the whole world we've built of capitalism and extraction, and just it goes deep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what we do is based on the assumption of human specialness.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and it's
and it's possible that like we're talking about, I don't want to just sit here and be naysayer, but it's possible that one of the major, and I'm not the only person to think this is this is certainly a thread in contemporary philosophy, that perhaps the biggest thing that we can do to shift our shift the trajectory that we're on in terms of like the environment is to stop thinking of ourselves as unique and special and outside of the broader networks, right?
Yeah.
We want to go Buddhist on, we're going to just call it like Indra's net, right? Like, right. If we think of ourselves as special and unique and outside of that, then we get into a mindset where extraction is totally fine, right? And it's all about what's good for us. But if we combat that and we come from a place of recognizing that we're interconnected, right? Yeah. Maybe things will change. Maybe so. Not.
Yeah.
I hope so. Sometimes I'm optimistic, sometimes I'm not, right? It's on my dark days, I'm less. On my good days, I'm more optimistic.
I am hopeful that the neuroscience will be an avenue in which it's kind of proven, so to speak, that animals have feelings and emotions. I think it is so obvious. So
yeah, I think.
Prove it, but yeah,
I think that honestly, I think that has been proven.
Yeah,
I think we can now talk about that in past tense, right? Cool. The scientists who work on this have developed enough literature that, from this perspective of science, this isn't actually a question anymore. Right now, that doesn't mean that people, like everybody, accepts that, right? As we know from the climate debate, just because something is fairly settled science doesn't mean everyone is going to go and act accordingly, right? But I think from the science side, I don't think there's too much debate anymore.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, well, thanks for sharing your thoughts and wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely, Julian. It's always great to be back.
Okay.
Yeah. See you later. Talk to you soon.